I don't know how many of you know me. I'm Shawn Wildermuth. I have been talking about ASP.NET Core for a while, and my new passion is Visual Studio Code. So before I get started, let me get sort of a sense of the room. How many of you are tired because we've already had 5 sessions? Uh-oh, that's a big number. I'll try to be entertaining then. No pressure on me, I'll be fine. So how many of you have actively been at least playing with ASP.NET Core? Oh, that's a pretty good number. Pretty good number. And how about Visual Studio Code? Wow, that's a really big number. I usually get 4 guys in the front who are really excited about it. And so I'm very excited by those numbers. So the first thing that's important to me to say is Visual Studio Code isn't about replacing Visual Studio. I use both products pretty commonly, and it depends on the kind of project I'm working on. If I'm working on a 19 or someone told me about a 138 project solution they were working in, I don't think I'd really want to be doing that in Visual Studio Code. But for building ASP.NET Core applications, I think Code is a good option for the right kind of developer. So let's talk about a couple of things before I get into code. No pun intended. So exactly what is Visual Studio Code for those who haven't looked at it? It's a lightweight IDE, and IDE might be pushing the name. It's a lightweight container for code. It might not be even an IDE, but it's close. It's open source, which I like, because at least I can take a look at what's going on. It's cross-platform, so that if I have to go from client that's in a Mac-based environment to a Linux-based environment to a Windows-based environment, I can use the same tools. And there's something about the way they've developed this that I've been really impressed with, in that the experience is pretty close to exactly the same on the different environments. I've been sold this promise of cross-platform before, right? Java run anywhere was always the biggest joke to me, was it runs poorly everywhere. Unless you want it to run well, you need to know more about these things. But I've really been pretty impressed with how it handles on different operating systems. It's good for people that are developing in more than just .NET. So one of the nice things about it is I can be doing Node in 1 minute, ASP.NET Core another minute, working on a Python script, hopefully not working on a PHP site. I could be doing all of those in really the same environment, and that appeals to me. I like this, free. Anyone like free? Okay. And I really like its community support and the large catalog of extensions that exist. And one of the ideas behind the way ASP.NET Core specifically works with VS Code is they've written the extensions to support this. Instead of sort of baking it in and making it another large, bloaty IDE, they've said, well, let's write an extension to support CSharp and the things we need for ASP.NET Core so that we know if the way extensions work should be good enough, right? That Microsoft is using the same things that third parties are using to extend Visual Studio Code. The other big question for me was, who should be using this, right? What sort of developers should be using it? And so the first question I like to ask people is a lightweight editor important to you? And this is a weird question, but let me talk to you about it in a very personal way. I'm a coder. I'm not a developer. I'm not a programmer. I'm not an architect. At the core, I'm a coder. What coders meant to me is that when I was on a VIC-20 in 1982, I was able to just type code. When I was writing Clipper code in the late 80s, I was using QEdit because I could just type code. And at some point, Visual Studio got me to a point where I would have to wait sometimes to write code because it started to do a lot of this background compilation and Intellisense that really I started to feel was getting in my way. How many of you are ReSharper users? Wow. How many wish it were faster? I really like ReSharper as a product. I'm not here to say anything bad about it. I really am not. But I stopped using it almost 10 years ago because I just felt like it was getting in my way. Because again, I'm a coder. I want to be writing code. So do you need an IDE that runs on different platforms? There is a new version of Visual Studio for Mac that's out there. It's really, what was it called? Mono Studio that's sort of been rebranded. So it's really not the same experience on different platforms. Code is really the solution for when you need the same tool on multiple platforms, including Linux, as surprising as that is. Is customization crucial to you? Now, customization in Visual Studio has always been, for me, a bit of a headache. It's all GUI based, which again, I'm a coder, I like to type in text files. And I want to even be able to think about how to transfer those settings. Do the way I set up my tool, is it specific to a language? Is it specific to a project? Is it specific to a machine? How do I move it from machine to machine? These have always been tense sort of discussions in Visual Studio for me. So I really like the way they do customizations. We'll talk a little bit about that. And this is an important one. Are you comfortable with command line interfaces? The reason I say that is there's a bunch of stuff that code doesn't do that command line tools do. And is that okay with you? If you want the IDE to do everything for you and to sort of be magical in that way, and you're more comfortable using a mouse to navigate things, code might not be the tool for you. It is not meant to be a replacement for Visual Studio if you're really comfortable there. Are you a polyglot developer? So if you do deal with different languages that may not be supported or supported well in Visual Studio. Because this is at its core, Visual Studio Code is just a text editor that happens to support extensions. It's much closer to Sublime than it is to any of the products from JetBrains. I can't think of any of them all of a sudden, like WebStorm. Because at the core of it, it's just this really fast text editor. So that's it for slides. Let's stop talking about bullet points, because I hate bullet points too, but I want us to sort of start on an even keel. So to just talk about the starting point is code.visualstudio.com is where you go to get this tool. So if you haven't downloaded, if you haven't played with it, let's just mention that. And you'll see that there's versions for Mac, PC, and different Linux distributions. Not every single Linux distribution is supported, but most of the big ones are. And these installers are really pretty simple. I mean, you can even get a tar file, open it up, and just be able to run it on a Linux box. So we're not talking about an arcane sort of tool that's sitting out there. And if you don't know how to get .NET, you will also need on these platforms ASP.NET Core to do a lot of the things I'm going to be showing you. So I'll just make that as a caveat. I'm not going to show you exactly how to get and install on different platforms. There's really good docs for that. Go to .net. No, there's no .com. Just .net. I don't know why did they do that? Put a dot and I have to say dot again. It's very frustrating. So let's talk about ASP.NET Core and Visual Studio and code. But before we do that, come on, I want you to be able to see this. Can you guys see that? Okay, good. It's nice in the center. Hopefully it's big enough. If you just run code, I'm going to be showing you on a PC because I like to run Steam games, and so I don't have a Mac. Sorry. But this will work pretty much the same on Mac and Linux. So Trust me, I have an upcoming course that shows it running on all three, but the security at American airports right now get scared if you have 3 laptops with you. So that's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. But if you just run code, you can run it from the start menu or wherever you want. I just ran it at the command line. You're going to get this look that, of course, you can't see because it's off the edges. But let me bring this in a little so you can see the whole beautiful thing. Come on. And there's not a lot to it at first breath, right? We're literally in an untitled file, and there's these magic icons on the left. And if this looks sparse, it's on purpose, right? It's sparse because it's meant to really handle writing code, right? There's not a lot of things in the way of project panels. Each of these left items will open up basically a flyout of what it can do. And let me just walk through these 5, and then we'll get into ASP.NET in a moment. The Explorer is simply the list of files in whatever context you're in. Normally, you're going to open this as in the context of a folder you're working in. That folder will include whatever files in the project you're working in. So this does not open CS project files or solution files or invent their own file system. The file system is some directory that your code exists in. And that's a fundamental change in it. It doesn't change the way that .NET knows where things exist. It's just saying code's in a directory, we're going to use that as sort of the structure there. There's a search to find and replace. I won't really talk about that. There's the ability to run debugging, and if we have time, I'll be able to show you debugging in C# as well as in JavaScript. TypeScript also works, etc. And when I talk about JavaScript and TypeScript, I'm talking about both server-side and client-side. So if you were doing node development with this, you could do server-side JavaScript debugging. If you were doing web development with like ASP.NET Core, topic of the talk and all that, you would be doing that as client-side. Git integration. The Git integration is really kind of sexy. So let me show you that real quick, and then I promise we're going to get to ASP.NET Core. Nope. Wilderblog. Wilderblog is a project I have out there that's just the source code for my blog. And kind of embarrassing to have people look at it, but, you know, feel free. Pull requests welcome. So to open up code, I could open it up and file, open folder, find the folder. But because I want to be used to the command line, let me clear this so it's at the top of the screen, I can just type code in the name of a directory. And in this case, period for the current directory. And it's going to open that up in the context of that directory for me. So the difference here is that it now just shows me the structure of the different code I have. And this is a project that's out on GitHub. So it has Git, and it actually shows some changes that I haven't pushed to the server yet. All right? I haven't even pushed them to the local repository. So it's going to show me that we have changes. And the cool part is that when I click over here in changes, it's going to show me the exact pluses and minuses. I can actually look at changes locally and remotely directly inside of Visual Studio Code. And for me, that's a big win, because when I can't figure out what the heck I'm doing, because if we take this same root controller, let me close that for a minute, and look at it here in my controllers, see if we can find the change. Come on. There's the change also in the editor. It shows deletions, additions, as well as changes directly inside the editor. So I have a closer sort of relationship to Git if I'm using Git as my source control. Make sense? And the last tab that we're going to look at are extensions. And these are the way that you add functionality to this basic editor that is kind of dumb at its core. And I've added a few extensions here. We're going to talk about some of them as we go on. So let's get rid of this and let's talk about Visual Studio Core and how to create a new project. Because one of the problems when people come into Visual Studio Code the first time is they're used to just being able to say, okay, let's do a new project and let's see how this thing runs, right? That's sort of the, at least for me, that first experience with an IDE is let's make something so I can see how things work in it. And the problem with Visual Studio Code is there is no such thing. There is no magic directory for, for creating that. And so we're going to end up relying on one of two tools to do that. And Steve talked about some of those tools earlier today, so I won't dive into them that deeply. But one is using .NET New to create new projects. And also Yeoman is another project that would allow us to create new projects with ASP.NET Core. So let's do that. We're gonna write a bunch of code in Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to do pair programming with all 400 of you. I don't know if it's called pair programming with 400, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to say .NET New, and I want to create a web project. This is an empty web project. And I want to go ahead and give it a name. I'll call it Fun in Row. I know that's not how you say it, but people have been trying to teach me for 3 days now how to say the name of your town, and I apologize for butchering it. Woohoo! And so it went ahead and generated all the code for that project. And so if we look here, we'll see there's now a directory for fun in Baroque. I still can't do it. In your town. And I'm just going to say code period to open up this project in Visual Studio Code. Now, I started with an empty project because while we go through this process, I want to show you some of the things that you may have to do in code that isn't about generating this giant boilerplate. .NET New will create that large project with integrated security and with entity framework setup and with views and controllers and all of that. It will do that. I'm starting with an empty project sort of on purpose because I want to show you the experience of doing this at a pretty bare bones level. First thing I'm going to do is open up any C# file, because right now it doesn't know that this is an ASP.NET Core project. It just knows it's a directory full of files. And you'll see that it popped up with these two info messages. This is pretty small, and there's no way for me to make it bigger, but the top one says, there's some required assets. There's some magic configuration files that you need in order to build your ASP.NET Core project. Can I add them for you? Yes, please. And there's also another message that says you need to get all of the references that are inside of the CS proj. Now, I'm using ASP.NET Core RC4. This is after the loss of Project JSON and the decision by Microsoft to force on us MS Build. You can tell how excited I am about that change. But all these tools work with those latest changes as well. So let's tell it to go ahead and restore. Once it's restored, we're going to start to see things in the editor for C# that we might be used to in Visual Studio, like warnings for unnecessary directives. We're getting the references and info about the different classes like we would with Code Lens inside of Visual Studio. So we're not talking about an editor that's just going to allow us to write code without any help. The extension for C# that works with Visual Studio Code is trying to give you some close-knit experience to what you're used to in Visual Studio. And they're doing it with different technology. It's actually a team called OmniSharp that's supplying all of this. So let's come down here and let's pretend we're going to do, let me format that for a minute. I'm going to move this to the top so people in the back can hopefully see. Is that big enough in the back? Either they're asleep or I can't tell. Should be good enough. Okay, good. So if I just do something like console and press period, I'm going to get the same sort of Intellisense I'm used to, and it knows this because of the different references that are in the project, right? So I'm not giving up the ability to use Intellisense and smart things, but I'm still gaining the benefit of a much faster code editor, because this code editor right now only has the pieces that I need for C# and JavaScript. It doesn't also have web forms and WinForms and XAML editors and all these other things that Visual Studio has to support, right? And we can even see sort of the different overrides, and it's the same sort of things that I'm used to write fast code in Visual Studio. So I can get a lot of that once I'm using C# compiler in the project. This was one of the stepping stones, because for almost 15 years, I've belied Intellisense. I've told people that I thought it was lazy, and why can't we just, we know how to code, we should just be able to write, and Intellisense is, and then I hit 40, and I remembered that I can't remember anything anymore. And so I now have to rely on Intellisense, because I'm old, decrepit, and I'm going to die one day. That's not funny. Let me just pull up my script and make sure I got it. Okay, so we've got a project, and just to prove to you it works, I'm going to hit F5, which is what I would hit in Visual Studio. And I've got my beautiful website. This bare bones .NET website, this is all it does. I know the ones you're probably used to has Bootstrap and has a nice little layout. And this is where we're going to start from. So the interesting thing about Visual Studio Code that I'll talk about before we dig into this too deeply is this. I need to, as a user of Visual Studio Code, I need to make it mine. I need to figure out what it is that I like about it. So let's start with something called the command palette. That's Control-Shift-P, or what do they call it on Mac? Command-Shift-P to open up this, what can code do? And this is a replacement for us having a menu with 5 billion items in it, right? This is the replacement for having a context menu in the Solution Explorer that is taller than my screen, right? Probably not taller than yours. You've got 40-inch monitors at 6K or something, and so it fits, but wait till you get to be my age, and then you'll remember, can't be that high res. Okay. And this is going to allow me to do one of two things, command palette. This is going to allow me to do things like looking for user settings or workspace settings, which we'll talk about in a minute. Every command is in here, and what I like about it is if I just want to do something like format document, it's going to tell me that format document is a command, and it's going to tell me what the shortcut key that is currently there. So I don't have to use the command palette every time. I can start to build up my knowledge of what I need to be using. And if I hit Shift-P instead, nope, Control-P or Command-P on Mac instead, I get the same experience but for files. So instead of me having to grab the mouse, move it over, open up folders, I can then look for, let's look for web.config. No, we don't have one of those. Let's look for startup, right? It's going to find me the files, and once it's found it, I can just enter, and it'll open it up for me. So navigation between the files is something that I don't want to move my hands from the keyboard, because I'm a developer, not an artist, right? I know there's a couple of you here. We like you. We really do. But I'm not that guy. So let's talk about the user settings for a minute, because this is one of the places where I think it really, it's one of the things that makes me very happy. I already have some settings, and essentially what happens is the first time you go into settings, it's going to create this new file in one of your user document folders that is for this user. These are the settings that are going to override this left file, which is the default settings. And they've organized this so we can kind of see what the settings are. And these change the moment I type, the moment I save. So let's change my font size to 18, right? Or 14. 18 was a better idea, right? Let's get rid of draw sans and let's tell everybody we're a Windows developer by using Consolis, or however you pronounce that font. Ooh, that's much prettier. Okay, I can't read it. And there's also this magic button called the Workspace Settings. This allows me to have settings that are inside of a special folder in my folder, in my project folder, that is only going to apply to this project. And so if I'm a consultant and I have Bob's Pizza Shack, who insists on 4 spaces in tabs, and I've got William Morris Agency over here that insists on 2 spaces and 2 spaces and spaces, I can have those on a project basis without having to go ahead and reformat it every time I change a client, or especially in open source projects. For me, this is important because I'm supposed to follow the convention of what other people have written, even if they're wrong, right? We won't talk about why they're wrong. So let's go and talk a little bit about ASP.NET. So the default here, I'm trying to get it to not move up too far in the page. The default project I'm working with is not the one that I usually see in talks about ASP.NET Core. I like to use this basic project on purpose. And that's because I want people to understand why Core exists. Cross-platform is really interesting. Being able to have it all open source is really cool. But that, in my opinion only, I don't work for Microsoft, is not why it exists. It exists because the way that ASP.NET was built in 2001, 2002, everything depended on everything. So this project type doesn't have any framework for writing websites. What it has is the ability to, in run, by calling this method that says run, every time a web request comes in, run this Lambda, run this little chunk of code for me. This is the entire website we have so far. MVC isn't installed in this project yet, right? Or what if we don't want to use MVC? What if we want to use a third-party project that maybe is in a style that works better for us? Or we're only building an API, so we don't want to bring in all of the Razor stuff, right? We used to have to sort of turn all that stuff off, but knowing we were still loading it into memory, ASP.NET Core is built without that idea, that as we add the different frameworks, whether they're first-party from Microsoft or third-party from other people who have good ideas, we're not having to have the weight of system.web and MVC and these other things. So by default, all this startup does is say, I know I'm listening for requests. You're going to have to tell me in this configure method what to do with them. So I showed you that this worked, right? Our line here that says, just write out hello world, literally writes out hello world, that text. It doesn't wrap it in an HTML block. It doesn't put in some CSS to make it look pretty. It literally did what I told it to do, which was return a string, and it sent it over as the content it knew about, which was text. This isn't an HTML page in any way. So the new world of HTML development, of website development, could look like this, right? Is anyone excited about that? You wanted control over the whole experience. Now look what you got. Oh, I forgot to run it. Ooh, a serif font. We know it has to be HTML now, right? I'm not suggesting this. Bad idea, bad idea. I want to write stuff in MVC because that's what I'm used to. So let's come back here and let's stop this. And let's replace this with MVC. And the way you would do that, I know most of you are familiar with it, but I'm going to repeat it myself a little bit, is I'm going to take this thing called the application builder, and I want to tell the application builder to use MVC instead of some other code. I'm telling it, hey, when requests come in, hand it off to MVC so that MVC can see if it can serve that URL effectively, right? Doesn't mean that MVC is going to be the only thing that can do it, but we have MVC. Oh, we have the dreaded, oh, come on. The dreaded squiggly, right? Because it doesn't know anything about MVC because MVC isn't loaded. So the first thing we need is the ability to add this. Now in our new world of CS Proj, this is our new C# project file, right? It doesn't have a lot in it, but it has these magic lines that are package references. And a package is a NuGet package, not anything else, just a NuGet package. So let's come here, add a new package reference, and say MVC, press save. It'll tell me there's new dependencies. I'll tell it to restore. It'll call restore for me. Again, a few more steps than you would see in Visual Studio. But often I don't want to have it go get dependencies until I've added the 3 or 4 that I need, and I'm only going to maybe do it once. So here in Startup, use MVC works now, right? So let's see how we would actually make this into a full ASP.NET project, right? If you haven't done MVC before, this may be dissimilar, but if you've done ASP.MVC on any platform, you know there needs to be a controller, a controllers directory, and a views directory, right? Whoops, but not there. Views directory. So for the controller, I'm just going to create a new file, and I'll call it root controller.cs, right? I created a new controller, but I'm getting an empty file, and this makes me sad, right? I like the sort of boilerplate I used to get. And there's a couple of ways you can go about this. There's a bunch of snippet-like experiences that the CSharp extension adds, like saying class, and using this snippet for class, but that's still not very satisfying for me, right? We're still pretty far from where it is. I wrote an extension for ASP.NET MVC core snippets, and it's installed, I hope. So let me see if it's there. So let's write an MVC controller. And I'll call this fun with your town .controllers. And it just basically creates an index and constructors and sort of the base place for controllers. And so the idea here is that you're going to rely on snippets to do a lot of this code generation for you. Yeoman, until recently, actually had a bunch of scaffolding for individual files as well, but we're sort of in a middle state with they made some big changes, and so those are going to come back in a later release. It just doesn't work right now, otherwise I would show it to you. So this is a way to get at them if you want something to generate more than one file. So we've got a controller. We've got, oh, we have to actually give it a controller name. Hold on. I don't like controller name.controller. Do you? The snippet, if I would have continued typing it correctly, would have done all this work for me, but I'm going to fix it real quick. Is there anything more fun at a conference than watching people type? Oh my God, the excitement it's just riveting. So you see that even though this is ASP.NET Core, that if you've done MVC, this looks awfully familiar. Some of this construction stuff with logger is different, but the way we're building actions is pretty much the same. So let's do the same down here in views. Let's create a new directory for root, and then a new file in there called index.cshtml. And so this is where we would write our razor view. And this razor is the same way razors worked before. And I think I have no, I don't have a template for razor right now. So I'll just do HTML5, I think is the snippet. Nope. Oh, I have to tell it. Oh, no, it knows it's razor. I knew it was in there somewhere. Okay, good. We've got a body, and I'll just put up here in the header a really stupid piece of razor that a bunch of us have in here. Viewbag.title equals hello world. And we could have done this in the controller as well. And then I'll just use it here at viewbag title and h1 viewbag title. So we've got all the pieces for MVC that should work. So let's try to run this. Just F5 like we're used to. And it throws an exception. So what's interesting here is we're getting the C# and debugging experience the way we're used to, just pretty naturally. If we go ahead and look, because we've stopped here at the debug tab, we'll actually see information about the variables we can look at to see what is actually going on. So here's that magic exception. And we get this lovely message that says unable to find required services, that when I first saw it, I was like, who is writing these messages at Microsoft? It has to be an intern, right? Unable to find required services seemed like such a crazy, unambiguous or ambiguous message. Like, what does that mean? And in later builds, they made it a little clearer by expanding on it. What they really meant was that it couldn't find the required services, which really made me mad because it was actually accurate. Because one of the things that is new in ASP.NET Core that is important to me is that in this startup class where we set up everything, there's this method I didn't purposely talk about called configure services. MVC expects that certain services it needs are going to be there, and when I say there, what I mean is that it exists inside of a service collection. Service collection, IOC, dependencies, whatever you want to call them, you now have to have them. So if the way that ASP.NET Core works with these idea of services and these service collections is that out of the box, there is a fast but fairly simple dependency injection container built in to ASP.NET Core. But a really easy way that if your office or your buddies have all decided that an inject or structure map is arcanely more exciting than some other container, you can use that container. You can replace the built-in container very easily so that whatever one you've argued about and want to use in your company, you can use. But you have to use some container for services. There's no more not using dependency injection. So if you avoid using ASP.NET Core because you hate dependency injection, okay, right? I can't force you, but it's time. It's time. So how do we do this? This configure services passes in essentially the container to register services. But most of the built-in libraries just have the services in a single method, and that's what they do here. So services.add MVC will add all the pieces, all the services that MVC requires. There's some other methods in here to say only add the non-view services. If I'm not using the view engine, I'm only using the controller system and some other things to sort of break it down. But at a root level, we can do that. But what if we have our own services? Just so you can see what that looks like. Services, add, and I'll start with transient, which means don't keep an instance around. It's stateless, and I can create them quickly, so just make it a service that I can supply, but I'm not going to keep it around. There's also scoped, and the idea behind scoped is that within something they call a scope, which is typically going to be a request. There are other scopes that exist inside of ASP.NET, but for most developers, when you hear scoped, think of within a request cycle. So if you needed, let's say, a database connection, you might want to share that across several calls in a single request instead of having to new up a new connection to a database every time. That would be an example of something as scoped. And then there are singletons for things that are singletons. I won't go into what singletons are. I'm going to assume you know. So let's try running this now that the services for MVC are there. Cannot be found. That's a weird thing. What do you mean can't be found? I just did everything that I was supposed to do. I know there's about half of you going, how do you mess up? Does he know he messed up? It's not found because we don't have any routes. We just have a controller and we have some views. We have nothing in MVC to say, this is where this particular call comes from. Now, we could create a default route, but let me just do it at the controller level. And the main reason for doing that, for using it at the controller level, is because I never type the global routes correctly in front of a group of people. So I don't want either of us to go through that pain. So let's go back to the controller. I'll just go to root controller. And I can, right here on the index, I could give it a route, right? Let's say HTTP get. So I'm telling it what kind of verb it needs. And this may feel a little bit like the way that APIs were designed. In MVC, Web API and MVC are all one bundle of code now. And I'm just going to say, make this index our root, right? This isn't a very smart way to set up our routes. We would probably want to create a route at the class level, but just to make our code work, let's go ahead and just put the HTTP get there. Someone forgot an at. But you can see Hello World appears in the title, so we can know it works. So we've got an actual complete controller and view working, and we've seen the little pieces that had to be added, and there weren't a lot. So let's see how much time we have. Oh, good. My wife is back at the hotel, so I don't like her to be around when I tell this story. But we got married a couple of years ago, and before we got married, after we got married, we were traveling And I looked over at her Kindle, and it had a serifed font on it. She was reading a book with serifs on her letters. And I'm not saying I wouldn't have married her if I'd known that before. But it would have been nice to know, is all I'm saying. So these serifs, this font is really bothering me. So let's go back here and let's talk about that. So let's go to the view. Let me fix this since it'll bother me if I don't. And in our project, we have this magic folder called www. But before we do that, let's take it from the beginning. I shouldn't have even mentioned that folder, but we'll get to it in a minute. Let's call it site.css because we all call it that for some reason, right? I want CSS for my whole project, and I'm going to write bad CSS so that no one ever wants to hire me to be a designer. So I only write bad CSS publicly. And let's say font family equals, let's use Go UI so that if anyone comes to this website, they know I'm a Microsoft developer. It's important that they know that. And let's go ahead and make the size like 14 EM. I'm sorry, 1.1 EM. Because I'm trying to be a good guy. I should do pixels because I want people to know that I wrote CSS back in the 1990s, but this should be good enough. And so what we really want is inside the index, or this could be a layout page, is I want that line here. Now in Visual Studio, I used to be able to just grab this and put it here, and it's not what it does, and it's annoying. So this is another one of those things where I have to learn how to write proper style sheet. So I think it's a link rel style sheet, and I'll just say root site.css. And that should work. Well, let's run it. Doesn't work. Let's look at the tooling for a minute, and let's go to the console. And 404. It's hard to see on my tiny screen, but it is a 404. It can't find it. Well, that's weird. Microsoft and ASP.NET embraced this idea that almost every other platform had done previously, and that is don't allow your main project file and all subdirectories to be delivered via a request. What Microsoft did is say, hey, we're going to allow nothing in the entire project to be sent except for these extensions that we want, right? Let's let CSS and JS and da-da-da-da, and every time we ran into an exception, we had to write this new line of configuration that said, we also need PDFs. We also need TS files because we're going to debug TypeScript. Oh, we need map files as well, or whatever the case may be. Every time we had a new image formatter, we had to write these lines of configuration. We had to opt into every sort of file type. What every other platform did was say, we're going to make this special directory and anything goes there. You can deliver anything there, but all my code, you're not going to be allowed to deliver anything directly. And that's what happens here. In ASP.NET Core, the www root is that directory, is that magic directory. So let me create a folder in here for CSS. Let me move my site.css in it, and I will have to change this to say CSS, which I should have done a minute ago. Notice that the URL here is assuming that www root is the root of the website, and that is on purpose. www root is where you're going to put all those things that are deliverable over the wire as just files, but you're not going to have to expose www root as the directory name. In fact, you can rename it. You can call it _myfiles or whatever it is. Thank you. Let's go back and see if it worked. We're still getting it 404, even though I just promised you that www root should work, right? The reason is that list of things that are happening in startup doesn't include anything but MVC. And MVC is bad at delivering static files. You would think that maybe just delivering static files, that should just be built in. But again, this philosophy of adding the different items we want is really based on opting in. So use static files. That's a thing now. And that means we need to, in the CS proj, add that. But instead of adding it there, let's open up a console. And it's going to be too big. I'm going to use a new .NET command called add. The command, the CLI for .NET now allows us to add NuGet references by command line if you don't want to be editing the XML directly. Again, one of the philosophies here is we're going to give you a lot of options of how to do this and let you pick which ones make the most sense. Because we don't have Intellisense for these package names yet in any form, I don't know which is better. So let's see if I can remember it right. Microsoft.ASPNET Core.static files version 1.0.3. You have to trust me on that version number since it was off the screen. Really? Oh, I'm missing a very important package. Add package. You can add other things. Let's try that again. Woohoo! So if we go back, we'll see there's now the static files added to the project for us. Doesn't matter which way you do it. If you're more comfortable at the command line, do it at the command line. Go ahead and restore that. And then we'll see over here in startup, if we wait a minute, it should go away. And the problem we have, if we go back and look at this, is it still doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is it's still running. Just because I changed some code, code was in a debugging session and didn't know to stop that debugging. That might change, I'm hoping in the future. But what happens really, this will be the last kind of cool Visual Studio Code, or hopefully cool Visual Studio Code thing I'm going to show you. And that is the ability to change code and not have to run debug, run debug, run debug, which has been the cycle I've been used to in Visual Studio. So the first thing we need is actually a new reference here. There's an extension to the .NET syntax. Whoops. Where's the CS proj? There we go. Let me create a new item group for this. And I'm going to create, it's called, I have to always look it up the name, .NET COI Tool Reference. This is basically saying we need a tool, but this isn't really part of the runtime of the project. So sort of like the developer tools, not the, this package would never be deployed to servers. It's really only for developers. And version. And what we're looking for is something called the watcher. And that's Microsoft.NET watcher tools. And this is the weird one that you'll just have to learn. These are still so evolving that they're changing pretty fast. So whether you want to remember the versions now or not is sort of open to interpretation. So let's restore this so that we get this new package. Oh, okay, let me fix something real quick. Let me move this to 1.1 because the watcher only works, watcher I'm getting Only works with 1.0 for right now. So let me fix these version numbers. Sorry about that. I could have specified when I generated the project whether I wanted 1.0 or 1.1. 1.0 is the default, and I wouldn't have had to have done that. Let me try that again. Okay. And in this case, I can just run the project, and I'm going to say .NET run, which is how you would normally run the project. In fact, when I press F5, that's what Visual Studio Code is doing for you. But I can also say watch run. And this is an interesting little thing. What it does is it's watching the directory for you to change code and rebuilding it for you. So that instead of having to go through that continuous cycle, no, I already did that. Let's say, let's go to the root controller and let's set that viewbag.title equals hello from your town, just like we did earlier. And let's get rid of this line because it's now going to come from the view. And let's just see what this looks like now. Right? Now it says hello from, and we come over here to the C# code and say, and press save, and just refresh the page, and then do it again because it's too slow. You're going to see it change. I never did a rebuild at any point. And the reason for that is what this watcher is doing is it is noticing, unfortunately we're getting a lot of the others. Is that the right one? Nope. What the watcher is doing is it's noticing a file has changed and is starting a rebuild for you. So if you're not needing to debug immediately, you're really just iterating and iterating. We've been used to doing that with the Razor files and with CSS and with JavaScript. But this allows us to do it with the C# as well. So we can just iterate by changing code, refresh, changing code, refresh, depending on the speed of your machine and how fast it's going to be rebuild, how fast this is going to be. So I can really spend more time in the code editor instead of the debugger. Debugger's still useful because one of the options here is to go ahead and attach to that instance, debug, and then detach, and I can keep that cycle going alive. It's not the way you have to do it, but it's another option that I think is really sexy if you're doing very iterative development. Make sense? Let's go back to the slides briefly, and then I'll let you guys get coffee because you really, I'm assuming it's the long day and not my monotone voice that's putting you to sleep, but it's one of us. So if you want .NET or Visual Studio Code, those are links for that. This example will be up on my blog probably by tonight on wildermuth.com. And I have a course about ASP.NET up on Pluralsight, which you can get to there as well. Thank you so much for being here, and it's been exciting to come to your country.